Why did the barking stop the moment she stepped through the gate? 50 military working dogs had been trained to break men, trained to snarl at strangers, to bare teeth at uncertainty, to treat hesitation like prey. Their voices usually rose together, violent, thunderous, a warning stitched into the air. But when the small woman crossed the painted line at the Naval Special Warfare K-9 facility, something strange happened. The barking died. Not slowly, not hesitantly. It cut off like a switch had been flipped. Ivory Lawson didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the concrete, on the scuffed toes of her sneakers, on the broom she carried like it weighed more than it should. She learned long ago that attention invited questions, and questions had a way of opening doors best left closed. Behind her, the handlers noticed. They always noticed when things went wrong. Chief Petty Officer Derek Vance frowned, irritation flickering across his face as he scanned the kennel rows. Silence made him uncomfortable. Silence meant unpredictability. He tossed the broom at her feet, the handle cracking sharply against the ground. "Pick it up." She did, no flinch, no glare, just obedience. The laughter came easily after that. It always did. The jokes, the assumptions, the relief of believing the world was exactly as simple as it looked. Ivory walked toward Alpha Block without protest. The most aggressive dogs, the ones with files thicker than most service records, Rex, Titan, names whispered with a mix of respect and fear. Her heartbeat stayed even. Fear had burned out of her years ago. As she passed each kennel, massive bodies slammed against steel, teeth flashed, foam gathered, violence strained against restraint. Then she reached Rex. The Belgian Malinois lunged, then stopped. Sat. His tail moved once, twice. Ivory paused for half a breath. Recognition flickered behind her eyes before she pushed it down and kept walking. Behind the glass, men stared. They didn't understand what they'd just seen. Neither did the dogs. Not consciously. They only knew the feeling. The frequency. Something old, something familiar. Something they trusted. Why did the most dangerous dog on the base lower his head when she whispered nothing at all? The lock clicked shut behind her. Ivory heard it, of course she did. She always heard the small sounds, the ones that mattered. Titan rose slowly, muscles rippling beneath scarred fur. His record said unrehabilitatable. His posture said fear disguised as fury. Ivory set the brush down. She crouched. Not submission, invitation. Titan advanced, growl low, breath hot. Instinct screamed at him to attack. Then it hesitated. Because she wasn't afraid. Not the frozen kind, not the reckless kind. It was the absence of fear that confused him. Her eyes met his, calm, steady, honest. Titan stopped inches from her throat. And then something broke. Not him. The silence. He sank to the ground, head heavy against her knee, confused by the sudden peace settling into his bones. When the door opened and a technician gasped, Ivory didn't look up. "He's not angry," she said quietly. "He's scared." Those words carried weight. Too much weight for a cleaning lady. Why did she run toward the explosion while everyone else froze? The blast wasn't supposed to be real. Training accidents rarely are. But pressure doesn't care about intent. Ivory saw the body fall before anyone shouted. She was already moving before the sirens caught up to the moment. Not sprinting. Flowing. Inside the mock building, a handler struggled to breathe through the ringing in his skull. His dog circled, confused, torn between instinct and command. Ivory knelt beside him. Check pupils, pulse, breath. "Stand him down," she said softly. The signal came, the dog sat. Order restored. Ivory was gone before the medics arrived. No one thanked her. She preferred it that way. Gratitude created ties, and ties were dangerous. Why did every dog go still when the perimeter alarm sounded? That night the facility locked down. Floodlights cut the darkness into hard angles, radios crackled, boots pounded concrete. Ivory stood alone near Alpha Block, her posture different now, centered, alert. The dogs didn't bark. They watched, together, as if guarding something. Or someone. She felt it before she saw it, the shift in the air, the weight of a memory refusing to stay buried. She touched the challenge coin in her pocket, 7 stars worn smooth by years of quiet grief. "Not tonight," she whispered. The darkness listened. Why did a 3-star admiral salute a woman holding a mop? The attack demonstration should have been flawless. It was. Rex broke formation mid-run and crossed the field at full speed, not toward the target but toward her. When Derek grabbed Ivory's jacket and it tore, the truth spilled into daylight. The tattoo. The stars. The name whispered like a legend, dragged back into the present. Phantom. The survivor. The handler who walked out of Kandahar carrying 7 empty leashes and a promise she never spoke aloud. Ivory didn't cry. She hadn't allowed herself that luxury in years. She only knelt and rested her forehead against Rex. "They remember," she said. And the dogs answered. Why did 50 military dogs refuse to leave the bunker when ordered? The breach was real this time. The intruder stepped into the light with a limp and a familiar voice. "Hello, Phantom." Echo. The one who never came home. Weapons raised, orders shouted. Ivory stepped forward. "No," she said. The dogs moved. Not to attack. To shield. 50 bodies forming a wall between her and the world. No command given. No training invoked. Just choice. Recognition. Echo spoke of betrayal, of ghosts, of truths that refused to die quietly. Ivory listened. She always had. When it was over, when the threat dissolved into custody and questions and consequences, she stayed behind with the dogs. The facility returned to noise. The world resumed. But something had changed. She stood, dust on her knees, light breaking across the kennels. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't announce itself or demand recognition. Sometimes it simply acts. And those who remember. Remember. Why did the silence follow her instead of fear? Ivory felt it the moment she crossed into Alpha Block again, the way the air tightened, the way 50 trained predators shifted not with aggression but attention. It wasn't calm. Calm suggested rest. This was alertness, like a held breath. She told herself it didn't matter. She had come here to disappear, to work, to keep her head down and let time pass like it always did, one day blending into the next until the memories softened enough to sleep without gripping the sheets. But the dogs wouldn't let her vanish. As she pushed her cart along the concrete, the handlers watched from a distance they pretended was casual. Boots leaned against walls. Coffee cups paused midair. Men who trusted these animals with their lives suddenly trusted nothing at all. Every kennel she passed went quiet. Ivory didn't touch the fences, didn't speak unless she had to. She moved the way she always had, efficient, deliberate, conserving energy. It was the same rhythm she'd used in places where mistakes meant body bags. She told herself that was just habit. The truth was heavier. The truth was that every time she passed a dog, something in her chest tightened. A familiar ache, not sharp, not fresh, just there. Constant, like scar tissue pulling when the weather changed. She stopped in front of Titan's kennel. The German shepherd rose immediately, but not to threaten. He waited. Ivory crouched slowly, knees complaining the way they always did in the mornings. She met his eyes and saw confusion there, a question he didn't know how to ask. "I know," she whispered, "me too." Behind her, a lock clicked. She registered it without surprise. Some part of her had been waiting for it since the broom hit the concrete on her first morning. The handlers would say it was a joke later. Hazing, tradition, a way to test toughness. They always had words for cruelty that made it sound smaller than it was. Ivory exhaled through her nose and turned. Titan stood between her and the door. Not blocking. Guarding. Her pulse remained steady. Fear had a different sound inside the body, sharp, frantic, demanding. This was old ground, familiar. She lowered herself again, slow enough not to trigger instinct. Titan's ears flicked, his weight shifted. He took one step forward, then stopped. The growl never came. Ivory rested her forearm on her knee and waited. Waiting had kept her alive more times than she could count. Waiting let the truth surface. Minutes passed. Outside, someone laughed. A phone buzzed. Life continued, unaware that something fragile was unfolding behind steel and wire. Titan finally lay down, his massive head settling against her thigh like it had always belonged there. Ivory closed her eyes for half a second. The ache deepened. When the door opened and a horrified voice whispered her name, Ivory didn't startle. She only stood, brushed dog hair from her jacket, and stepped past the stunned technician without comment. "Please don't," she said quietly when the woman tried to speak. Not because she was afraid. Because she was tired. Why did the dogs listen when she spoke only once? The explosion came later that day. Wrong place, wrong time, that was how it always started. Ivory was on the second floor of the admin building when the shockwave rattled the glass. She felt it in her teeth, in the old injuries that never quite healed right. Her body moved before thought could catch up. She didn't run. She flowed. Downstairs, through doors, past people frozen by indecision. Inside the mock structure, smoke curled where it shouldn't have. A handler lay on the floor, disoriented, one hand pressed to his ear. His dog paced in tight circles, whining, torn between commands and instinct. Ivory knelt beside him. Her hands moved with a memory deeper than language. Check, assess, ground. "Look at me," she said. "Stay with me." He did. She signaled the dog with a gesture so small it was almost invisible. The animal froze, then sat, eyes locked on her face. Order returned. Not because she demanded it. Because she understood it. She left before anyone could ask her name. That night the alarm sounded. Not loud, not panicked. Alert. Ivory stood alone near Alpha Block, mop forgotten, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the floodlights. The dogs went silent again, not hunting silence but watchful. She felt the memory press in. Kandahar had smelled like dust and blood and hot metal. The dogs had gone quiet then too, moments before everything broke apart. Her fingers found the coin in her pocket. 7 stars. She closed her hand around it like a lifeline. "Not tonight," she murmured. The darkness shifted, then stilled. The alarms were later blamed on a sensor glitch. The dogs didn't agree. Why did the handler's questions feel heavier than accusations? By morning, the whispers had started. The janitor who moved like an operator. The janitor who ran toward explosions. The janitor the dogs obeyed without command. Derek Vance cornered her near the supply room, frustration etched into every line of his face. "You're not what you say you are," he said. Ivory met his gaze without challenge. "I never said I was anything else." His jaw tightened. "Dogs don't react like that, not to civilians." "Dogs react to truth," she replied softly. "People react to rank." He didn't like that. She knew he wouldn't. She walked away before the conversation could become something uglier. Later, a detection exercise went wrong. Shadow broke formation and crossed the yard, nose pressed to her jacket pocket like it had found something it had been searching for. The laughter from the observers sounded wrong, too sharp, too forced. Ivory's fingers pressed briefly against the coin through the fabric. She felt the past stir. Why did the attacked dog refuse to attack her? The demonstration was meant to impress. Instead, it exposed everything. Rex launched on command, powerful and precise until he veered, until he crossed the field and stopped at her side, head pressed to her leg, whimpering softly. Ivory didn't move, didn't reach for him. She knew better than to interrupt recognition. When hands grabbed her jacket and fabric tore, the world seemed to tilt. Air rushed over skin that hadn't seen daylight in years. The tattoo spoke before she could. Cerberus. 7 stars. K9 Dev grew. Silence fell like a held breath. Ivory didn't look at the people. She looked at Rex. They remember, she said, voice breaking just enough to let the truth through, even when we don't. The Admiral saluted. Others followed. Ivory felt nothing at first, no triumph, no relief. Only the familiar weight of being seen, when she had worked so hard not to be. Why did she choose silence instead of vengeance? After the crowd dispersed, she knelt among the dogs. They pressed close, not demanding, not wild, just there. Family. She told them nothing. They didn't need words. When the facility finally quieted, Ivory remained where she was, hand resting on warm fur, eyes closed against memories that never truly slept. She had come to make sure they were safe. She hadn't planned on being found. But some bonds outlast secrecy. Some loyalty survives blood and time and silence. And some dignity doesn't announce itself. It simply kneels beside those who remember and stays. Why did every instinct she had screamed that the past was moving closer? Ivory hadn't slept. She sat on the concrete floor of Bravo Block as dawn crept in, knees drawn up, back against the cool steel of the kennels. One by one, the dogs had settled near her during the night, not barking, not packing, just present, as if they understood that something inside her was bracing for impact. Sleep had never come easily since Kandahar. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard it again. The first shot, the second, the sudden, terrible silence when the radios went dead one by one. She learned to rest without surrendering to sleep, to exist in the thin space between awareness and exhaustion. That morning, the facility woke differently. Handlers moved slower, spoke quieter. No one joked. No one threw insults. The revelation from the day before had settled over the place like fog, thick, disorienting, impossible to ignore. Ivory stood as the first shift arrived, brushing dust from her jacket, reclaiming the mask she wore so well. Janitor, contractor, invisible. Except invisibility had been taken from her. Derek Vance watched her from across the yard, the weight of what he'd learned bending his posture. He looked smaller somehow, not weaker, just human. Ivory avoided his gaze. Not out of resentment. Out of mercy. She knew what shame felt like when it settled deep enough to change how you walked. Why did the dogs tense before the alarms ever sounded? It started subtly. A ripple. One dog lifted its head, then another, then another. Ears pricked, bodies shifted, tails went still. Ivory felt it too, not fear, anticipation. The kind that tightened the muscles and sharpened the senses. The kind she'd felt moments before breaching doors in places the maps pretended didn't exist. She stopped mid-step. Her breath slowed. The dogs weren't reacting to sound. They were reacting to absence. Storm, she murmured, barely audible. The Malinois at the end of the row moved closer, shoulder brushing Ivory's leg. A grounding presence, a promise. Then the alarm screamed. Full lockdown. Not a drill. Handlers ran, gates slammed, radios erupted in overlapping commands. Ivory didn't move. She stood in the center of the yard as if anchored there, eyes fixed on the eastern perimeter. The dogs followed her gaze, 50 heads turning in unison. Commander Hayes's voice thundered through the loudspeakers. "Master Chief Lawson, get to the bunker immediately." She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. The bunker was reinforced, safe, logical. It was also retreat. "I can't," she said quietly. "What?" Hayes's voice crackled back, edged with urgency. "He's here." The dogs shifted, bodies forming an unconscious arc around her. Why did the shadow that stepped into the light feel like a wound reopening? He walked with a limp now. That was the first thing she noticed. The second was his eyes. Eyes, same sharp intelligence dulled by something darker, harder. "Hello, Phantom," he said. The voice carried across the compound, rough with disuse, familiar enough to make her chest ache. "Echo," Ivory breathed. The name tasted like dust and memory. Weapons snapped up around them, orders shouted, safety protocols screamed for control. Ivory stepped forward. The dog stepped with her. "No," she said, not loud, not forceful, absolute. The handlers froze. Echo's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Still good with them," he said. "Figures. You're supposed to be dead." "So are you," he replied lightly, "in some reports." She studied him. The civilian clothes that didn't quite hide military habits. The way he stood just off-center, minimizing target profile. The careful placement of his hands where everyone could see them. He wasn't here to fight. "Not yet." "What do you want?" she asked. "The truth," he said, "same as you." Behind her, 50 dogs stood guard, not growling, not aggressive, protective, as if they understood the stakes better than the men gripping rifles. Admiral Blake's voice came over the radio, calm, controlled. "Security teams stand down." Ivory didn't look away from Echo. 8 years, she said. "You let me think you died." Echo's jaw tightened. "I didn't let you think anything. I couldn't reach anyone. By the time I got out, the world had already buried me." "You could have tried." "I did," he snapped. Then softer, "I watched from a distance. Funerals, citations, you disappearing. Thought that was intentional." She felt the old anger stir, hot, sharp, dangerous. "Why are you here?" she asked again. Echo glanced at the dogs, because they remember too. Why did the truth feel heavier than the years of silence? They spoke inside the command building, stripped of spectacle but not tension. Echo told his story in pieces, fragmented, like memory itself. He hadn't died in Kandahar. He'd been buried under rubble pulled out by people who weren't supposed to exist. Sold information, names, routes, dogs. Betrayal didn't always come from the enemy. Sometimes it wore familiar uniforms. "I followed the trail," he said. "Every lead pointed back to Cerberus, to what we lost, to what they turned into data." Ivory listened without interrupting. Listening had been her survival skill, long before handling dogs. "And the coin?" she asked. Echo hesitated. "I needed you to know I was alive, and I needed you to come here, where it started." The room felt smaller. "You used the dogs," she said quietly. "I used memory," he corrected, "same as you." Her fingers curled. "That's where we're different," she said. "I protect them, I don't bait them." Silence stretched. Outside, the dogs waited. Why did forgiveness feel harder than anger? Later, alone among the kennels, Ivory sank to the ground again. Storm pressed close. Rex settled on her other side, his presence solid and grounding. She rested her forehead against her knees. 8 years of unanswered questions had hardened into something she carried like armor. Now the armor was cracking. Forgiving Derek and Mason had been easy. They were ignorant, not malicious. Echo was neither. He knew exactly what he was doing. The dog sensed her turmoil, soft whines, gentle nudges. "I know," she whispered. "I don't know either." She looked up at the rows of faces watching her, not as a handler, not as a legend, but as one of theirs. Whatever came next would test everything she believed about loyalty, truth, and survival. The past wasn't finished with her. And this time, it wasn't asking permission. Sometimes resilience isn't about standing strong. Sometimes it's about choosing not to run, even when the ghosts finally step into the light. Why did her hands shake only after the danger had passed? Ivory didn't notice it at first. The way her fingers trembled as she rinsed her mug in the sink. The way the water sloshed against porcelain like it was heavier than it should be. Adrenaline had always come easily to her. Letting it go never had. Outside the window, the kennel yard looked ordinary again. Sunlight, movement, voices returning to normal pitch. The dogs lay scattered across the concrete, some asleep, some alert, all present. Normal was a lie she almost believed. Echo had been escorted to a secured wing under heavy guard. Officially, he was a person of interest. Unofficially, he was a crack in the foundation, proof that the past wasn't done collecting its debts. Ivory pressed her palms flat against the counter until the shaking stopped. She had learned that control wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing what to do with it. Why did Command want her story now, after years of silence? The briefing room felt smaller than it had any right to be. Ivory stood at the head of the table, hands clasped loosely behind her back. Admirals, commanders, analysts, faces that had read her name in reports but never imagined she'd be standing in front of them, alive and breathing. "Start from Kandahar," one of them said gently. She swallowed. Memory rose like heat. "We were inserted to evaluate a compound," she began. "Low visibility, high-value intel. K9 element was there to confirm chemical presence and secure exits." Her voice didn't waver. She told this story before, just not out loud. "The dogs alerted early," she continued. "Too early. We thought it was nerves. It was." She paused, letting the silence carry the weight. They smelled fear and familiarity. The room leaned in. "Someone inside already knew us," she said. "Our patterns, our dogs." The betrayal hadn't been a surprise in hindsight. It never was. They asked about Echo. She answered honestly. "He believed he was exposing corruption," she said. "He believed the ends justified the means." "And you?" the Admiral asked. Ivory met his eyes. "I believe how you do something matters as much as why." That seemed to satisfy him. Why did the dogs react differently to Echo than they did to her? Later that afternoon, she stood outside the secured wing, watching through reinforced glass as Echo sat alone, wrists cuffed, posture relaxed in a way that was anything but. Storm growled low beside her, not aggressive, wary. "They remember what he smells like now," Ivory murmured. "Conflict, justification." Dogs understood contradiction better than people did. Echo noticed her and stood slowly. The guard hesitated but allowed her closer. "You always did listen to them more than us," he said. "They never lied to me," she replied. His expression faltered. "I didn't mean to hurt them." "That's the problem," she said softly. "You didn't mean not to." Silence stretched between them. "You could still help," Echo said finally. "There's more. Names, programs, people who think loyalty is a weakness." Ivory exhaled. "And if I say no?" "Then they'll find someone else," he said. "Someone without your restraint." She turned away before he could see the conflict in her eyes. Why did the past ask her to choose again? That night she returned to the kennels. The dogs stirred as she entered, some rising, some staying put, all aware. She walked the rows slowly, resting a hand against familiar fences. Names whispered in her head, faces that weren't here anymore. 7 empty leashes. She stopped in front of Rex's kennel. "You didn't get to choose," she said quietly. "Neither did I." Rex's tail thumped once. Ivory slid down to sit on the floor, back against the wire. The cold seeped through her clothes, grounding her. For years she had believed survival was enough, that if she stayed alive and stayed quiet, she was honoring the dead. Now she wasn't so sure. The world had moved on, corruption adapted, memory faded. The dogs hadn't forgotten. Maybe that was the difference. Why did the command order feel like a betrayal and a chance at redemption? The directive came just before dawn. Echo would cooperate. Names would be exchanged. A task force would be assembled to dismantle what remained of Cerberus. And Ivory Lawson would be reinstated temporarily. Advisor, specialist, handler. She stared at the words until they blurred. She hadn't worn the uniform in 8 years. She hadn't planned to ever again. Storm pressed his head into her knee, as if sensing the weight of the decision. "What if I can't do this?" she whispered. The dog didn't answer. He stayed. That had always been enough. Ivory folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket beside the coin. Outside, the sky lightened, indifferent to her hesitation. She stood, shoulders squaring, not with bravado, but acceptance. Sometimes redemption isn't loud. Sometimes it arrives quietly, as a choice to step forward again, even when you know exactly how much it can cost. Why did the dogs sense the danger before a single order was given? Ivory felt it in the ground first. Not sound, not movement, a pressure, a subtle wrongness that crept up through the soles of her boots and settled in her bones. The dogs felt it too. One by one, heads lifted, bodies aligned, muscles coiled without command. She stopped walking. Around her, the task force moved with quiet efficiency, operators checking gear, radios murmuring confirmations, a helicopter idling beyond the fence line. Everything looked controlled, prepared. Too prepared. Ivory raised her hand. The convoy halted. Derek Vance glanced back at her, irritation flashing before discipline caught up. "What is it?" She didn't answer right away. She knelt, placing her palm flat against the concrete. Let the moment speak. Storm whined low. Rex shifted closer, shoulder brushing her arm. "They're not reacting to us," she said finally. "They're reacting to anticipation." Derek frowned, meaning someone knows we're coming. The air changed. Orders were revised, routes adjusted, contingencies layered on contingencies. No one questioned her. That still felt strange. Why did putting the uniform back on feel heavier than taking it off? Ivory stood in the locker room alone, fingers resting on fabric that still smelled faintly of storage and time. The uniform fit. Of course it did. Her body had never forgotten its shape. She had. The mirror reflected someone older, not weaker, just marked. Lines at the eyes that hadn't been there before, a stillness that came from loss rather than confidence. She touched the Cerberus tattoo and let her hand fall. This wasn't about reclaiming anything. It was about finishing something. Outside, the dogs waited, not excited, not restless, ready. She exhaled and stepped out. Why did the mission feel less like an operation and more like a reckoning? The target wasn't a compound this time. It was a logistics hub disguised as a civilian research facility. Clean, legal on paper, poisonous underneath. Echo's intel had been precise. Names, times, transfer points. Truth had weight. Ivory moved with the K-9 team along the perimeter, every step measured. The dogs worked quietly, noses low, eyes sharp. They alerted to hidden passages, to walls that lied, to rooms that held fear like a scent that never washed out. Inside one corridor, Storm froze. Not alert. Refusal. Ivory crouched beside him, reading the tension in his frame. "What is it?" Derek whispered. "He's not afraid," Ivory said. "He's warning me." She followed Storm's gaze to a sealed door. Behind it, movement, controlled, patient. An ambush waiting to happen. The plan changed again. Lives were spared because a dog remembered what humans forgot to question. Why did Echo's voice over the radio feel like a test? Halfway through the operation, Echo's voice crackled through Ivory's headset, patched in under strict supervision. "Left stairwell is compromised," he said. "They're hurting you." Ivory closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. "Why help now?" she asked. A pause. "Because I crossed a line," he replied, "and you didn't." She absorbed that without comment. Trust wasn't rebuilt with words. It was rebuilt with consistency. Why did the bunker feel familiar in all the wrong ways? The underground vault mirrored Kandahar too closely, reinforced walls, narrow access points, poor sightlines. The kind of place that turned mistakes into memorials. Ivory's chest tightened. Not panic. Memory. She signaled the dogs forward, letting them choose paths, letting instinct override architecture. The first shot rang out. Then the second. This time, Ivory didn't freeze. She moved. She guided. She protected. Not chasing enemies, but preventing collapse. A handler went down, leg trapped under debris. Storm and Rex moved without command, forming a barrier as Ivory pulled the man free, breath ragged but alive. 7 years ago, she hadn't been fast enough. This time she was. Why did the truth finally surface when everything was on the line? In the core chamber, the evidence waited. Servers, logs, contracts stamped with authority and signed with indifference. Cerberus hadn't died in Kandahar. It had evolved. Echo had been right about that. Ivory stared at the data feed, feeling the old anger stir, but it didn't control her. It sharpened her. "Package secured," Derek said quietly. The dogs sat around the room, watchful, guardians of something fragile and dangerous. Justice, maybe. Or accountability. Why did the extraction feel like relief and grief at the same time? As dawn broke, the team emerged into pale light. No cheers, no celebration. Just breathing. Ivory knelt in the dirt, hands resting on Storm's neck, forehead pressed briefly to his fur. Gratitude surged, sharp and unexpected. "You did good," she whispered. The dog licked her cheek once, then sat back, mission complete. She stood slowly, joints aching, heart steady. This hadn't erased the past, but it had answered it. Why did she realize too late that the hardest part was still coming? As medevac rotors faded into the distance, Ivory felt the weight settle again, not of danger but consequence. Reports would be written. Names would surface. Some would fall. Others would be protected. Truth never moved as cleanly as bullets. Derek approached, helmet tucked under his arm. "Command wants to talk about next steps." Ivory nodded. She looked back at the dogs, mud-streaked, tired, alive. Whatever happened next wouldn't belong to her alone. Sometimes redemption doesn't come as forgiveness. Sometimes it comes as responsibility. And the quiet resolve to carry it, even when the cost is finally understood. Why did the quiet after the mission feel louder than any gunfire? Ivory noticed it the moment the dogs settled. Not collapsed, not exhausted. Settled. They lay around her in loose formation on the bunker's outer ring, bodies angled outward, eyes half-lidded but aware. Guardians at rest. The kind of posture that said the danger had passed, but trust had not been returned to the world yet. The sun was climbing, washing the compound in pale gold. Morning birds dared to sing. Somewhere far off, Engines moved on schedules that had nothing to do with what had happened here. Ivory sat on the concrete step, elbows on her knees, helmet resting forgotten beside her. Her hands were steady now. That worried her more than the shaking ever had. Stillness meant processing, and processing meant feeling. Derek stood a few paces away, giving her space without being told. He'd learned that about her. Some people needed debriefs, others needed silence. She reached into her pocket and took out the coin. 7 stars caught the light. 7 leashes that had gone slack in her hands years ago. She turned the coin over and over, thumb tracing each worn edge, each memory pressed into metal. "I did what I could," she whispered, "not to Derek, not to Command. To them." The dogs closest to her shifted, as if acknowledging the confession. Why did Command's praise feel hollow, and their questions heavier? The debrief lasted hours. Ivory answered everything, calmly, precisely, without embellishment. She spoke about roots and reactions, about how the dogs had hesitated at certain thresholds, about how human certainty often arrived too late while instinct rarely did. They asked about Echo. She told the truth. "He cooperated," she said, "but cooperation doesn't undo damage, it just stops it from spreading." They asked what she wanted next. That question hit harder than any accusation. "I want the dogs protected," she said after a pause. "Not reassigned like equipment, not pushed until they break." One of the admirals nodded slowly, another looked away. Change always made people uncomfortable. Finally, they asked the question no one had said out loud yet. "Will you stay?" Ivory didn't answer immediately. She thought of the nights she'd slept on floors because beds felt too vulnerable, of the jobs she'd taken that kept her anonymous, of the careful distance she'd built between herself and anything that might matter. Then she looked at the dogs through the glass. Storm sat at attention. Rex lay with his chin on his paws, eyes never leaving her. "I'll stay," she said, "as long as I'm useful." That was the closest thing to hope she trusted. Why did Echo's final words linger longer than his mistakes? They allowed her one last conversation with him. Supervised, recorded, controlled. Echo looked older now than he had during the standoff. Smaller, the adrenaline gone, leaving only consequence behind. "You were right," he said without preamble, "about the dogs, about everything." Ivory stood, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You didn't come here for absolution," she said. "No," he admitted. "I came because I didn't want the truth to die with me." She considered him for a long moment. "That doesn't make you a hero," she said quietly. "I know." Silence settled. "Take care of them," he added, nodding toward the kennels. "They deserved better than what we gave them." Ivory held his gaze. "So did we," she replied. She turned and walked away before either of them could say more. Some conversations didn't need closure. They needed boundaries. Why did the dogs refuse to leave the bunker that night? It happened without command, without signal, without explanation anyone could put into a report. As dusk fell, handlers attempted to rotate the K9s back to their standard kennels. One by one, the dogs resisted, not aggressively, not anxiously. They simply stopped, sat, lay down, formed a perimeter around the bunker entrance. 50 bodies, silent, immovable. Ivory watched from a distance, heart tightening. "They're not scared," Derek murmured beside her. "No," she said, "they're deciding." Command tried gentle orders, incentives, familiar handlers. Nothing worked. Finally, someone asked the question no one wanted to. "What do they want?" Ivory stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice, didn't issue a command. She walked to the center of the circle and sat on the concrete. The dogs relaxed instantly. Not because she was in charge, because she was home. Why did staying feel more dangerous than leaving ever had? That night, Ivory slept in the bunker. Not on a cot. On the floor. The dogs settled around her like a living wall, warmth and breath and presence grounding her in the now. She dreamed, but not of Kandahar. She dreamed of open fields, of running without weight, of hands unclipping leashes without fear. When she woke, her face was wet. She didn't wipe the tears away. Some things deserved to be felt fully. Why did dignity reveal itself in the smallest moments? Weeks passed. The facility changed. Quietly, dogs were given more rest, more autonomy, more respect. Handlers listened differently, watched more closely. Ivory trained them, not just how to command, but how to observe, how to recognize stress before it turned into damage, how to understand that loyalty was a relationship, not a resource. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. The dogs followed her because she never asked them to do something she wouldn't do herself. Sometimes that meant standing between them and danger. Sometimes it meant sitting beside them in silence. Why did the bunker remain guarded long after the threat was gone? Even months later, the dogs returned to it at night. Not every night, but often, as if remembering mattered. Ivory let them. Memory, she'd learned, wasn't a weakness. It was a form of respect. On one quiet evening, she sat at the bunker entrance, watching the sky darken, Storm's head resting against her thigh. "You stayed," Derek said softly from behind her. She nodded, so did they. He hesitated. "You ever think about leaving again?" Ivory considered the question. "I think about choosing," she said finally. "That's new for me." Derek smiled faintly. "Glad you chose us." She didn't answer. She looked at the dogs instead. Why did the story never make the headlines? There were no viral videos. No medals broadcast on morning shows. Just a classified report, a quiet policy shift, a few careers ended, a few truths exposed. Ivory preferred it that way. Some stories weren't meant to be consumed. They were meant to be carried. On her last walk of the night, she stopped and looked back at the kennel yard, at 50 silhouettes resting in peace because they trusted the world just enough. She slipped the coin back into her pocket. 7 stars. No longer a weight. A promise kept. Sometimes strength doesn't shout. Sometimes loyalty doesn't ask permission. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak at all. It simply stays, guards what matters, and refuses to walk away when walking away would be easier.